Government has become very enamored with this concept of the value of data. And you might remember a program called Total Information Awareness that was a Department of Defense program where the government wanted to collect all available data and to sort of have it in one place, or at least accessible simply by one organization, to where they could collect all the details about a person's life and put it together. And once the public found out about that, they were outraged, and it was ultimately defunded. But that mentality has never gone away, and it's actually been recreated through a lot of different agencies in the way that they collect and retain data. You know, the FBI now has something called an investigative data warehouse that in 2008 had 1.5 billion records in it. So, you know, these huge data warehouses are favored by the government. Even if they can't use the information today, they think that some technological algorithm is going to be developed that will allow them to see patterns in the flow of data that allow them to predict future criminal activities. But, you know, what I've always told them is if somebody had, you know, some kind of process in which they could predict the future, they wouldn't be selling it to law enforcement. They'd be selling it to Wall Street, and they'd be selling it to Las Vegas.
November 13, 2001. President George W. Bush issues a 3-page executive order authorizing the creation of military commissions to try non-citizens alleged to be involved in international terrorism. The president will decide which defendants will be tried by military commissions. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld will appoint each panel and set its rules and procedures, including the level of proof needed for a conviction. A 2/3 vote is needed to convict a defendant and impose a sentence, including life imprisonment or death. Only the president, with the Secretary of Defense, has the authority to overturn a decision. There is no provision for an appeal to U.S. civil courts, foreign courts, or international tribunals, nor does the order specify how many judges are to preside on a tribunal or what qualifications they must have. The order also adopts a rule of evidence stemming from the 1942 Supreme Court case of the United States versus Quirin that says evidence shall be admitted as would have probative value to a reasonable person. This rule, according to Judge Evan Wallach, was repeatedly used in World War II and in the post-tribunal wars to admit evidence of a quality or obtained in a manner which would make it inadmissible under the rules of evidence in both courts of the United States or courts martial conducted by the armed forces of the United States. Evidence derived from torture, for example, could theoretically be admitted. It should be noted that the order is unprecedented among presidential directives in that it takes away some individuals' most basic rights, which claiming to have the power of law, with the United States Congress not having been so much as consulted. During the next few years, lawyers will battle over the exact proceedings of the trials before military commissions, with many of the military lawyers arguing for more rights for the defendants, and with Haynes and the Justice and White House lawyers, Gonzalez, Addington, and Flanagan, taking a more restrictive line. Both Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell were left outside the circle during the drafting of this directive. Rice is reportedly angry about not being informed. In January of 2002, the Patriot Act permits federal agents to secretly obtain information from booksellers and librarians about customers and patrons reading internet and book buying habits, merely by alleging that the records are relevant to an anti-terrorism investigation. The act prohibits librarians and booksellers from revealing these requests, so they cannot be challenged in court. A University of Illinois study now concludes that federal agents have sought records from 220 libraries nationwide since September of 2001. The Justice Department refuses to say how many times it has invoked this Patriot Act provision, but Assistant Attorney General Daniel Bryant says that people who borrow or buy books surrender their right of privacy. Some libraries and bookstores are unhappy with the law and begin to fight back in a number of ways. Some libraries have posted signs warning that the government may be monitoring their users' reading habits. Thousands of libraries are destroying records, so agents have nothing to seize. Many librarians polled say they would break the law and deny orders to disclose reading records. On January 11th of 2002, Guantanamo received its first 20 prisoners from the Afghan battlefield. It is reported that the prisoners are hooded, shackled, and possibly drugged during their flight to Cuba. Pictures of prisoners being transferred in conditions clearly in violation of international law are later leaked, prompting an outcry. But rather than investigating the inhumane transfer, the Pentagon begins investigating how the pictures were released. The prisoners are sent to this base leased by Cuba to the United States because it is on foreign territory and therefore beyond the jurisdiction of U.S. law. Rumsfeld, acting on the advice of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, publicly declares them unlawful combatants and therefore not entitled to the rights of the Geneva Conventions. Rumsfeld would say unlawful combatants do not have any rights under the Geneva Convention. Though, according to Rumsfeld, the government will, for the most part, treat them in a manner that is reasonably consistent with the Geneva Conventions to the extent they are appropriate. There is no reason to feel sorry for these defendants, as General Richard B. Myers' message, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest ranking military officer in the United States, he also went on to say, these are people who ignore through hydraulic lines at the back of a C-17 to bring it down. Senior British officials privately called the treatment of prisoners scandalous, and one calls the refusal to follow the Geneva Convention not benchmarks of a civilized society. Vice Admiral John Poindexter begins running a shadowy new government agency called the Information Awareness Office. Poindexter, formerly President Reagan's national security advisor, is known for his 5 felony convictions of lying to Congress, destroying documents, and obstructing Congress in its investigation of his role in the mid-1980s Iran-Contra affair. Later, his convictions were overturned on a technicality. Far from apologizing, Poindexter said it was his duty to lie to Congress. The New York Times notes that his new agency is developing technology to give federal officials instant access to vast new surveillance and information analysis systems. The new office is part of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Poindexter was also known for his controversial role in shifting control of computer security to the military in the 1980s. Mark Rotenberg, former counsel for the Senate Judiciary Committee, said, it took 3 administrations and both political parties over a decade to correct those mistakes. Surprisingly, Poindexter's appointment is little noticed until later in 2002, when the Total Information Awareness Program is revealed. Incidentally, several others involved in the Iran-Contra affair also find jobs in the Bush administration, including Elliot Abrams, John Negroponte, and Otto Reich. 2 months later, some political activists began noticing they are being subjected to extra surveillance and security checks when flying in the month of March of 2002 inside the United States. Numerous government agencies later admit they are using a no-fly list that bans certain people from flying. The government says about 1,000 names are on this list. It is also admitted that there is a second list that subjects anyone on it to increased security every time they fly. A number of agencies, including the CIA, FBI, INS, and State Department, admit that they have added names to such lists, but no agency admits controlling the list. There are no guidelines to determine who gets on the list and no procedures for getting off of it. If someone is wrongfully on it, airport security personnel note that the list seemed to be netting mostly priests, elderly nuns, Green Party campaign operatives, left-wing journalists, right-wing activists, and people affiliated with Arab or Arab American groups. The U.S. military internally announces the creation of a new global data collection system called the Total Information Awareness Project, headed by Poindexter. Interestingly, the early accounts of this program, now in the public eye, suggest its budget is a significant amount of $96 million. It is also reported that parts of the program were already operational before the public revelation, whereas later it is said to be only in the conceptual stages of development. By April, there are 300 detainees in Guantanamo being held at Camp X-Ray, which are transferred to Camp Delta. Currently, some of these operations are still in place. And until we stop the federal government from abusing our civil liberties, we will be the future enemy combatants.